So, with President Nelson passing away yesterday, there are a lot of questions that need to be asked. Questions of about him, about his funeral, what will happen with General Conference this weekend, who the next president of the church will be. There's a handful of questions out there, and I wanted to take some time to answer a couple of them. Just because I do know some viewers of the channel are newer to the church. They were not here 8 years ago when you saw President Monson passed away and President Nelson was um, set apart as the president of the church. So, wanted to go through some of these questions, not saying that these are all the questions that need to be asked, but there are a handful of good ones, especially if you don't know the process of going from one president of the church to the other. This will be a good overview for you. So, the list of questions I've got right here, we'll just run right through them. So, who will lead the church right now? So, what happens when a president of the church dies is the first presidency is basically dissolved. It doesn't essentially exist right now. The apostles that are still alive, so President Oaks, President Irene, return to the quorum of the 12 apostles, and the quorum of the 12 apostles holds the keys and the priesthood to run the church here on the earth right now. So, who is the senior apostle? So, who is leading the quorum of the 12? So, you have had the acting president of the Quorum of the 12 has been Jeffrey R. Holland. But the reason he is the acting president is because Dallin H. Oaks was in the first presidency. But Dallin H. Oaks is the senior apostle. He was set apart the longest ago. When we talk about seniority, we're talking about how long they've been serving as an apostle. So, President Oaks is the president of the Quorum of the 12. President Holland was just the acting president. So, he is the senior apostle. So, what happens to the current first presidency? I kind of should have ordered that a little bit different. Already talked about that. It gets dissolved. So, right now, there is only a quorum of the 12 apostles with President Oaks at the head. How is the next president of the church selected and set apart? So, I want to turn to actually a talk called The Heart of a Prophet. This was given back in April of 2018 by Elder Stevenson after the passing of President Monson. He actually goes into a lot of these questions that I'm about to answer. So if you want to go read the talk, go read it. It's a great resource. It's where I got a lot of my answers to help you. But he talks a little bit. So how is the next president of the church selected and set apart? Let's go back and read just his wording. So he talks a little bit about what I said. So the Apostolic Interregnum. Okay, I didn't actually say that, but that's the period of time between one president of the church and the other. And just in case you don't know, because I didn't know what interregnum means, it's just a period when normal government is suspended, especially between two successive reigns or regimes. So right now you're seeing essentially the suspension because there's no president of the church. So the apostles are there. They hold the keys. The church still operates and is running. And that's what he explains. So during this period, the Quorum of the 12, under the leadership of the Quorum President, jointly holds the keys to administer the leadership of the church. There is always a head in the church, and if the presidency of the church are removed by death or other cause, then the next head of the church is the 12 apostles until a presidency is again organized. So let's keep reading what he says. So he talks about in 2018 the process between President Monson dying, President Nelson being set apart as the new prophet. So he says they hold a meeting together in the sacred and memorable meeting with all the brethren, so all the apostles, the members of the Quorum of the 12. Following a well-established precedent in unity and unanimity, the brethren are seated by seniority in a semicircle of 13 chairs. Now, the reason they had 13 at the time was there was actually another vacancy of an apostle, so rather than there being a 14th apostle there were 13 back in 2018. But they raised their hands to first to sustain the organization of the first presidency and then to sustain Russell M. Nelson as president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then it says the sustaining is followed by the Quorum of the 12 gathering in a circle, placing their hands upon the heads of President Nelson to ordain and set him apart, with the next most senior apostle acting as voice. So, going back to this question, So how is the next president of the church selected, set apart? It's whoever the senior apostle is. And it will happen with a vote of unanimity between them at a point after revelation is given that they should reorganize the first presidency. So that will happen sometime here in presumably the next couple of days or weeks. How long will that transition take? That's what I just answered. Now, I did want to show you. I pulled up some church data, and I'm going to pull this over right here, talking about the length of time that has taken place with the Apostolic Interregnum. So early in the church, it was a long time. So after Joseph Smith was martyred, Brigham Young, he was the president of the Quorum of the 12. He led the church as the Quorum of the 12 Apostles without a first presidency and set apart president for 3 years and 6 months. And then he saw after Brigham Young died, John Taylor did similarly 3 years, 1 month, 11 days. And then the length of time kind of got less and less over time. So Wilford Woodruff led the church after John Taylor passed away for a year, 8 months, 13 days. But then you see, I'm not going to read each name, but 11 days, 7 days, 3 days, 7 days, 5 days. They're just relatively short, brief, just a couple of days or weeks. Now, here's something interesting. So, after President Monson passed away in 2018, it was the Apostolic Interregnum lasted for 12 days before the first presidency was reorganized. President Nelson set apart. Now, the big question, and here's a big question mark right now, is President Oakes is leading the Quorum of the 12. How long until the first presidency is reorganized? And I don't have an answer to that. I guess God has an answer. Only time will tell. But the reason I think it's a question is because you have General Conference this weekend. Now, that brings up a couple of other questions that are here. So, what will happen with General Conference weekend? I'll come back to 6 in a second. So, it is actually not unheard of to not have a church president at General Conference. Now, if we go back to this chart I was showing you, obviously in the 1800s, there were years where you still had General Conference. It was taking place, but you just had whoever was the acting president of the Quorum of the 12 presided over conference, directed the business affairs of the church in that way. So you saw that here with John Taylor, with Wilford Woodruff, with Brigham Young. But if you actually come down to David O. McKay and George Albert Smith, George Albert Smith, he passed away on April 4th of 1951. So conference that year was, I believe, the 7th. I have it right here. Nope. The first meeting of conference started on a Friday at April 6th. So it was like April 6th, 7th, and 8th was General Conference that year. So George Albert Smith, who was the prophet and president of the church, died 2 days before conference. So very similar circumstance to literally what we're going through right now. You have General Conference this weekend. There is not a president of the church. So what happens is presumably we're going to see the exact same thing, I would guess, unless if the first presidency is reorganized in like the next 3 days. So it says right here, President Smith's passing leaves the quorum of the first presidency disorganized, and the presiding authority of the church now rests with the quorum of the 12. At the General Conference, you had President David O. McKay, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12. He presided over the conference. And then that following Monday, he was actually set apart as the president of the church. So it was kind of an interesting conference just because they actually had, as part of the conference, the funeral for George Albert Smith. And then it was immediately following conference that Monday that President McKay was set apart. So you might see a very similar thing here. I obviously don't know when it's going to happen or not. But what I do know is the General Conference will still operate the exact same. You will just have President Oakes perhaps presiding at the time as the president of the Quorum of the 12 rather than the president of the church. Now, let's go back to who the new counselors will be. We don't really know. It's done through Revelation, where President Oakes will get to choose via revelation with God from the existing members of the Quorum of the 12 who his new counselors will be. So that'll just be something that we'll see. I mean, you did see with President Nelson previously with President Monson, we had Dieter F. Uchtdorf. He was one of the counselors, but he was no longer when President Nelson became prophet. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the same counselors. It can be literally any of the members of the Quorum of the 12. Will more temples be announced at conference? Now, obviously, time will tell, and I don't know with a surety that I can say there will be this conference, but I imagine there will be. The reason I think that is because you've heard from more than one general authority in previous conferences that temples will continue to be built, that they will continue to be built at the same rate and pace, and I'm guessing you're still going to hear temple announcements this conference, whether or not President Oakes has been actually set apart as the new president of the. That's my assumption. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think business will be as usual. The church still moves on, and even if you didn't see President Oakes set apart as president of the church for a couple of years, like you did in the 1800s, I think the business of the church still takes place. So you'll probably see temples announced. Now, this is an interesting question. Will another apostle be called at conference? If President Oakes is not set apart as the new prophet before conference, I don't think you will see an apostle called at conference. I know traditionally we see apostles being announced at conference, but there are a couple of exceptions. So, and I pulled up the exceptions. So, of all the current members of the Quorum of the 12, the only ones that were called outside of conference was Elder Holland was called in June of 1994. President Holland, excuse me. Elder Uchtdorf was called in February of 2008. And then Elder Kieran was called in December of 2023. So if you don't hear of an apostle called this weekend, I bet they won't wait 6 months. I think 6 months is a really long time, and they're busy individuals, the apostles. There's a lot going on in the church where I think you'll see an apostle called sooner rather than waiting till the April conference to hear if you don't see one this conference. But I only think you'll see one at conference. Well, the president of the church by revelation selects the new apostles and calls them. So I don't think, I mean, I could be wrong here, and maybe you can correct me in the comments if you're in an apostolic interregnum, that the president of the Quorum of the 12 can call an apostle, but I could be. So maybe somebody can correct me if you know better doctrine than I do. Now, did President Nelson have a message pre-recorded? Will it be shown at conference? I think that's a great question. It was one that was already asked to me, so I threw it in here. The answer is I literally don't know. Obviously, you'll find out this weekend. I imagine, I really don't know, just because I do know from the past, you've heard even like Wendy Nelson say that President Nelson spends a lot of time mulling around with specific words. So every word he said was literally the message he needed to give. So I know he spends a lot of time in advance coming up with his messages, and I imagine probably had recorded something, unless if his health was so bad the last couple of weeks that he hadn't done anything. But I wasn't getting the vibes that he was like super unhealthy for the last like 2 months. So I don't know, maybe there will be a message, maybe it will be shown, maybe it'll just be released to his social media if he had one rather than played at conference. I'm really not sure, and It would be interesting. Now, the other interesting thing, and I don't know as if this will necessarily happen, but you saw with in 1951, George Albert Smith's funeral was part of conference. Now, I don't know as if that would happen. That could be really interesting if it is, and if it was, maybe that's where they could show a pre-recorded message that he might have already had for conference. And the reason I say pre-recorded is the last couple of conferences, President Nelson hasn't been able to get up in conference, so he's come into conference with pre-recorded messages. So the assumption was that maybe there already was a message out there because he wasn't planning to be able to stand up at the pulpit and give a message. Um, knows though. I guess we'll find out. When will the funeral take place? And this is a question I've kind of maybe covered a little bit. Maybe it'll be during conference. I would kind of like for the respect of him and his family for it to be separate. But also you have every general authority has already flown in for conference. So a lot of them are already there. So maybe it will be this weekend. Like maybe you'll see the funeral on Thursday or next Monday. I guess that would be similar to what happened with President George Albert Smith in 1950. Then will there be a public viewing or a public memorial service? That has yet to be announced. I'm guessing there will probably be a public and a private service, but I don't know if that is true or not. So, anyway, if you have more questions, feel free to message me or you can comment on this video. I'd be more than happy to answer them. I don't know if there'd be enough of them to make another video, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have different answers than I do as well, feel free to throw it down in the comments. Just because I'm learning just as much as some of you guys, but I did want to answer some of the questions that I'd already been receiving. That's where we're at right now. We'll see what happens with conference this weekend and see how long the Apostolic Interregnum lasts.